I will be reminding you again. Okay. So now, a great pleasure to introduce from the University of Durham, Michael Questier. Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation here today. I thought I'd talk about the resonances in and after the Reformation of English Catholicism, and specifically about the resonances and influence of Catholic martyrology. There's not much connection, I have to say, with Luther, but I imagine he could have written some fairly rude pamphlets about what follows now. For those scholars of early modern England and Britain who think, if at all, about Catholic martyrology, what probably springs to mind is Bishop Richard Challoner's Memoirs of Missionary Priests, as it's called. That on the left is Bishop Challoner, and that's on the right is the memorial they put up to him in London. I think he died just after the Gordon riots. Those are some of the volumes of manuscripts in the Westminster Cathedral archives, which he used for the writing of his big book on martyrdom. On the left, that's a modern edition of it. On the right is the huge Victorian edition of his work, 1878. That's actually Challoner, after they disinterred him from his resting place at, I think, Milton House in Berkshire, because they wanted to put him in the cathedral in London, which they did, and they dressed him as a bishop before they did it. And that's where he rests now. His book is quite extraordinary. The Victorian edition of it has these wonderful illustrations. That's the arrest of the priest John Jennings in 1591. You can see Richard Topcliffe, the notorious Richard Topcliffe, at the door waving a sword just before they apparently chucked him downstairs. And there are many of these illustrations. That is, you can see the lady under the door is Margaret Clitheroe, who was executed in York in the 1580s. Now, much of this material looks or even anti-historical. Challoner's work launches more or less straight into its subject with an account of the legal proceedings against the seminary priest Cuthbert Main down in the West Country in 1577, and persists case by case down to 1681, claiming in effect that every individual who perished under the Elizabethan penal legislation against Catholics was part of the same continuous process, and the persecution was itself unceasing. Challoner's preface to the second part of his work declares that the whole book was essentially factual, not in any way polemical, and based on solid evidence with a grudging gesture at the benefits of living now in the mid-18th century in a more tolerant age, though of course he published his book just before the last of the Jacobite rising, so what people thought about that, one doesn't know. Challoner's bold rhetorical distinctions between politics and religion and his claims for absolute objectivity in his historical judgments must have provoked some fairly sharp Protestant intakes of breath, just as many Catholic readers, both then and subsequently, have concluded that the bishop was simply telling it like it was. But whichever way that one reacts to Challoner's work, and indeed to the text in the martyrological tradition on which he drew, and the Catholic narrative of the later Reformation in England, which he helped to define, one cannot simply assume that the material which he deployed is historically shallow. Challoner was in fact doing something remarkably similar to, as Peter Lake describes it, what Samuel Clarke did when he wrote his Lives of Godly Protestant Divines. Both projects constructed with utterly different polemical assumptions, but in similar literary and rhetorical ways, accounts of the kind of religion which they took to be most obviously compatible with the proper operation of the national church. For scholars who see the Elizabethan period in particular, and the later English Reformation in general, as defined by moderation and compromise, these Catholic stories of oppression, violence and brutality, against Catholics of course, are hard to comprehend, and often seem to be so far outside the mainstream as to be virtually irrelevant. In any case, if the English experienced persecution in the 16th century, it was surely not under Elizabeth, or even really under Henry VIII, but during the uniquely frightful, though mercifully brief, reign of Mary Tudor. But I would argue it is worth thinking about the historical implications of the Catholic martyr tradition as it's developed, well, both in Challoner's time and then subsequently down through the centuries. And this is why I hope there's a connection between this paper and the theme of this day conference. However bizarre you might think that Rome's criteria for establishing heroic sanctity are, hocus pocus as John Humphreys recently described it on BBC Radio 4, the fact is that those in the Reformation past whose cases were taken forward via the processes which the Roman curia deploys for these purposes the fact is that exercise is in large part a historical one. The way in which Rome ordered its agents in the past, and does now actually, to investigate and establish the case for the saintliness of those whom popular fame and public acclaim within the Catholic community, those within the community who'd been identified as martyrs, was always rooted first and foremost in a research-based account of those people, and in this case a research-based history of the Reformation. In fact, the first direct instruction from Rome to gather evidence of martyrdom came in 1626 with the Congregation of Propaganda's orders to this man, Bishop Richard Smith, who was a vicar apostolic, to proceed with this exercise. And Smith, this is of course in the 1620s, there's relatively speaking sort of toleration. So Smith's agents are able to tour all over the country in order to collect the material that they need, the appropriate historical and legal documents, including, for instance, assize records, some of which have since vanished, and that's the catalogue at Westminster, or the volume at Westminster, which contains some of Smith's work, and that's the first page of the catalogue of martyrs, which he constructs and sends to Rome. In the 1640s, early 40s, there was a Papal Commission set up to proceed with the so-called ordinary process, that is, led by local episcopal authority for this purpose, but its work actually was suspended when the relevant documentation fell into the hands of the Parliament in 1643. However, during the civil wars and in and after the popish plot agitation of 1679 to 81, Catholic commentators and writers continued to collect and publish accounts of those whom they regarded as Catholic martyrs. For example, the Yorkshire priest in the early 18th century, John Knaresborough, and that's a photograph of 5 of the 7 manuscript volumes which he copied out or wrote out, is really a history of the Church in England by reference to martyrdom, all in a beautiful sort of copperplate hand with the sources that he used down the right-hand side. He conducted a sort of fact-finding mission across the English counties, writing to consult people whom he thought he might have useful information. Among those people was the antiquarian Charles Easton of Hendred Hall in Berkshire. That's a photograph of the inside of the house, a very, very beautiful property, pre-Reformation, much of it. I was in the library at that point. I should have been taking photographs of the books, but I thought the view out of the window was nice. You could even see my car, so I thought I'd take a picture of it. Knaresborough wrote to the people like Easton, said to say, you know, can you help me with your collection? Because he actually wrote to Easton and said, we know you have one of the finest collections of books and manuscripts for this purpose in the country. And actually Easton wrote back. Obviously you can't read his tiny handwriting, but he writes back to Knaresborough and says, actually, I'm now out living in rural Berkshire and you have no idea how boring it is here. And he says something like, I was never one for hunting or husbandry. He said, so almost any distraction would be welcome. So I'm you'll happily send you whatever you want. And then, of course, there was Challoner as well. Challoner comes about 20 years after Knaresborough. So all through the 18th century, people are gathering and discussing this kind of material. Following the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850, Catholic hierarchy in 1850, and in fact in and after the Third Synod of Westminster, as it's known, in 1859, there commenced at last the formal back and forth process of petitioning and answering to Rome concerning the record of those reckoned to have been heroic witnesses to the faith in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the narrative of that process is lengthy and complex, certainly too lengthy for a short paper of this kind. But briefly, the so-called ordinary process commenced finally in London in June 1874, looked at the cases of 353 people between 1535 and 1692. In this phase of the process of investigation, there were 37 sessions in all. I mean, the thing functions actually like a court, like a series of judicial proceedings, and went on for about 6 months. The people involved included the Jesuit John Morris, who was a noted scholar in his own right in the later 19th century, assisted by various priests of the London Oratory, including Thomas Knox, who produced the editions of the diaries kept at the seminaries on the continent, which are still in use today. Among others, the leading Catholic Charles Weld was called to give testimony, and he witnessed, for example, that he had seen the instrument of torture called the Scavenger's Daughter in the Tower of London, where it was then kept, even though it wasn't still there in the 1870s. Weld described how it worked and referred to the woodcut of it in some of the editions of Challoner. Weld remembered it in the Tower because Catholic parents used to take their children there to see it, as I was by my father. Weld added that as to the claim that the servants of God really suffered for a religious cause and not merely for a political one, I believe Challoner's book to be perfectly authentic, and I've had the opportunity of testing many parts of it by original documents that he could not have known. Moreover, all that's been discovered since his time tends to confirm it. Weld testified also, and this was crucial for Rome's purposes, he testified that the tradition of reverence for martyrs had gone on covertly for centuries. We were always taught to venerate them, he said, although this could not be done publicly in the church, because you can't preempt Rome's decision. So you can't, I mean, until Rome's actually set its seal on these claims to heroic sanctity, you can't do this in public. It could be done, though, in private by those who possessed their relics or portraits or lived in the neighbourhood of their martyrdoms. And Weld's sister described how she remembered her mother pointing at the place of execution of Fathers Cornelius Green and others near Dorchester, and she remembered she used to make her sisters always pray to them as she passed. Charles Weld and his wife had provided the reliquary for the hand of Margaret Clitheroe. It's in the chapel of the Bar Convent in York, and that's a photograph of this very, very beautiful 18th century, I'm sure it's an 18th century chapel, which is designed in such a way that you can't see it from the road, that the edifice, the structure of the chapel inside the building is in effect invisible from the road because of worries about reaction from the public. And that is a less good photograph of what is claimed to be the hand of Margaret Clitheroe, so I believe there's doubts about the authenticity of it. Anyway, these negotiations between England and Rome produced a series of beatifications. That's the declaring of the, it's as well the second stage of the process towards canonization. A series of them in December 1886 and May 1895, leaving several hundred people with their cases still under consideration. Rome's bureaucratic processes continued to grind away rather slowly, and of course certain international political events in the 1910s, the First World War, interrupted the task of recovering interesting historical facts from the 16th and 17th centuries. But a second and so-called apostolic process, that is at the direction of the Holy See rather than purely under the control of the local bishop, was authorised for Westminster in July 1922, opened a year later. Approximately 250 names were now considered for this process of beatification. Various objections were raised, as is usual in the course of Rome's investigations of the causes of those regarded as potential saints. For example, in the case of the martyr Edmund Sykes, the promoter fidei, the promoter of the faith, colloquially or popularly known as the devil's advocate, in Rome worried about the reports of his temporary lapse from the faith and was concerned that the record showed only that Sykes had been condemned for sedition, not for religion. In the case of the York martyr Robert Hardesty, the establishment of his heroic sanctity wasn't made any easier by the mistranslation in the body of evidence submitted to Rome, because all this stuff has to be written out in English and then translated into Latin and Italian, I think. The mistranslation of the word venison as, I'm not an Italianist, but I believe the Italian word for it is selvaggina, but they got that wrong and they used the word veleno, which means poison. Which left the devil's advocate concerned that a potential hero of the church, who'd allegedly sent aid, relief and food to the Catholic prisoners of conscience in York Castle, was in fact a potential mass murderer, which the people in Rome found very confusing. These years were marked by quite intense public Catholic enthusiasm for their martyrological heritage. Already by the late 19th century there were public pilgrimages to, for example, the ruins of Padley Hall in Derbyshire, which was the site of the arrest of the priests Nicholas Garlick and Robert Ludlam. The restored part of the building, which serves as a chapel there, now within the Catholic Diocese of Nottingham, is still the site of a shrine. And annual pilgrimages and processions attracted thousands of people, all crucial evidence for Rome, of course, of continuing cult and popular acclamation. The Sunday Times reported on the 9th of October 1927 the approach which was being made to the Foreign Office to secure the return and reinterment of the remains of the priest John Southworth, who'd been executed in 1654 during the interregnum. Those remains have been discovered in mid-July in their burial place in the old college buildings at Dowie, and it must have been regarded as highly significant as Rome reached its conclusions about the 1923 Westminster process. the sight of the body in its lead coffin, actually out of its lead coffin, left those who retrieved it in no doubt about what hanging, drawing and quartering had meant in practice. Subsequently, they were taken to England, first to St Edmund's College in Ware, and then in May 1930 to Westminster Cathedral. And this is, apparently this is in copyright, so it can't be shown on the website, but this is a Pathé newsreel recording the moment of the translation of his remains, Southworth's remains, into the cathedral. And there it is. I think they must have come down Ambrosden Avenue and then turned that way into the cathedral. There seems to have been a real sense of expectation at this point that the Holy See was about to endorse a particular and very reactionary reading of English Reformation history. As the Morning Post put it on the 24th of May 1929, anticipating that the majority of those whose names had been presented would get through, with the possible exception of the Japanese martyrs of the 16th century, this will be in point of numbers, perhaps the largest wholesale unified ceremony of beatification in the history of the Roman Church. That ceremony was also likely to be timed to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Catholic Emancipation Bill. In fact, after the consideration in Rome of all the evidence in 28-29, 136 only of the 252 individuals whose names had been considered in the Westminster process were beatified on the 15th of December 1929. It was very frustrating, apparently, for those who'd anticipated that all those named and presented would get through on this occasion. But Cardinal Bourne of Westminster continued to lobby for the recognition of, as they were called, the delati, the 116 people whose names had been deferred, or cases had been deferred or put back. And those cases started to be reviewed immediately in December 1930. Crucially, during this same year, there was issued a new, much more rigorous set of rules. That's the figure of Southworth, the figurine that rests in the cathedral today. There was a new, much more rigorous set of rules for the promotion of causes of those who might be acclaimed for their sanctity. Essentially, Rome said that you've got to be much more definite about the identity of these people, and you've got to provide better attested documents concerning them, and so on. It's worth remarking at this point that although it might, at one level, seem obvious enough, large portions of what are now regarded as the over-confessionalised urtext of English Catholic history, and which I think are usually assumed to be the product merely of a frankly naive introspective enthusiasm and piety, actually came out of the determination in and after the mid-19th century to secure Rome's recognition of the English martyr tradition, and were themselves a response to Rome's demands for sufficient historical proof of martyrdom. One thinks here of the bulky volumes of historical records collected, edited and published by people like the Jesuit Morris and his confrere Henry Foley back in the 1870s, and also the early volumes of the Catholic Record Society, which were a major scholarly achievement for the time when they were published. The doyen of recusant historians, the incomparably clever legal historian, the Benedictine Hugh Bowler, seems to have begun his research into financial and judicial records, specifically in order to assist the promotion of the cause. He was an Air Force chaplain, and his superiors simply told him that this was going to be one of his additional tasks. And a byproduct was, he produced one of the great legal scholars of his generation. So on one level, this was the product of historical confessionalization, though hardly any different in that respect from the obvious biases of several well-known and allegedly mainstream 20th century Reformation scholars who are not Catholics. But at another level, what we have here is a major intervention in the writing of English and British early modern Reformation history, one which, whether non-Catholic scholars noticed it or not, seriously challenged and arguably changed the field. And this came about both because of the determination in the mid-19th century to make the case for those identified as the Catholic martyrs of the Reformation in England, and also because, as I say, of Rome's decision to raise the bar in the processes and manner via which it recognised heroic sanctity. And this compelled those making that case to look for texts of various kinds that really hadn't been on any scholar's radar up to that point. Following Rome's decision in late 1929, however, to put back a number of those, as I say, whose names had been presented for consideration, those who'd promoted the cause up to that point were determined to find out what had gone wrong, as they saw it, and to comply fully with these new regulations established for the investigation of martyrs' causes. And that's what led, in and after the 1930s, but especially in the period after 1959, to what might be taken to be astonishing amounts of research into the cases of these people. And it culminated, as is well known in Catholic circles anyway, in the canonizations of 1970, the so-called 40 Martyrs of England and Wales, and then the beatifications of a further 85 individuals in 1987. The gathered evidence fills hundreds of box files in the archives of, as it was called, the Office of the Vice Postulation at the Farm Street Church in London, and that is actually the underground library and archive in that church. And you can see there's a door open on the left, and the files of the Vice Postulation are kept in there. What does all this mean then for the writing of English Reformation history? Even in the highly formulaic responses to the kinds of demands made by Rome for sufficient proof of heroic sanctity on the part of those who had allegedly suffered for their faith during the course of the English Reformation, the Vice Postulator's office and its agents of necessity resorted to a kind of historical antiquarianism, establishing every last ascertainable fact about the existence of those being proposed as martyrs for the faith. Those who sat in judgment in Rome on the post-Reformation English martyrs' cases first and foremost wanted to know that those who'd been identified as suffering servants of Christ were exactly who they were said to have been and did precisely what they were said to have done. Where the motives of the martyr had been questioned by contemporaries, accurately transcribed and attested documentary sources could be used to prove that this was the product merely of malice, or that the accusations against the victim could be trumped by a superior claim that the martyr had died for religion. It was then actually something of an irony that the resulting collection of material, all this stuff gathered in and now kept in these box files in that place, which testified to some of the sharpest contemporary collisions in both politics and religion of the period, couldn't actually be acknowledged as such by the collators of that material, even though the martyrological tradition among Catholics of the time was informed by precisely the perceptions of those in the post-Reformation period who thought that the relationship between church and state in both religion and politics had been grotesquely skewed and fractured by the series of malicious, corrupt and generally wrong turns taken by those who wielded royal authority. In turn, those who'd resisted royal authority, those Catholics who'd resisted the will of the crown, it was claimed to have been motivated only by religion and religious truth. As the Oratorian priest Thomas Knox phrased it in his introduction to his edition of the Diaries of the Seminary at Dowie, the seminarists were a body of simple-minded and zealous-hearted men, possessed with the one thought of rescuing souls from hell, not through the medium of political intrigue, but in priestly ways, by preaching, administration of the sacraments, and the celebration of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. They showed no signs of political motivation. We find no trace of enthusiasm among them, except for winning souls and for martyrdom. Which at some level, you have to say, is actually ludicrous. I mean, you know, I don't know how he got to that point. I mean, it just sort of isn't true at a number of levels, but of course it fitted all too well into certain kinds of revisionist account of the Reformation, where Catholicism, which is a very broad and in some way vague and almost anachronistic term for that period, was taken to merge seamlessly with a brand of conservative popular culture, and where Catholicism's own more radical and separatist strands were of little account. And so some of this stuff was extremely useful for a certain kind of post-war historian who wanted to rewrite the period in that way to use. So this is the slightly boring theoretical historical bit. You'll just have to pardon me for sort of going into a theoretical approach. More generally, there remains a question as to how the historian should approach martyrdom. Martyrs aren't an obvious class of people for the purposes, anyway, of systematic archive-based research. You know, in the way that you might do for, say, MPs or civil lawyers or people that you can research consistently through established sets of archival material. Arguably, the attempt, especially in Catholic studies, to recover all knowable biographical details about these people had a seriously distorting effect. The bulk of what the promoters of the cause gathered about the martyrs was essentially quotidian, evidence of birth, early life, locality, genealogy, education, and so on. The claim, even if only implicit, is that their origins, upbringing, and in the case of clergy, vocation and career, were so self-evidently unexceptional, except of course for the fervour of their spiritual zeal, that the eventual legal proceedings against them could not but be understood as simply malicious, that is, as the state was compelled to pervert justice in order to arrest, convict, and execute them. In turn, this contributed to the Catholic tyrannophobe account of the period, since so much of what one could recover of the quotidian existence of separatist Catholics apparently gave one absolutely no clue as to why some of them should have been targeted for destruction in the first place. except, of course, for the tiny minority of those involved in what appeared to be conspiracies, and they, by implication, were untypical, and were, of course, excluded from the process of establishing heroic sanctity. If we do as Brad Gregory very sensibly recommends, that is to confront the fundamental religious sensibilities, convictions, and practices of committed Christians who died for their faith, and reconstruct rather than, as Professor Gregory says, deconstruct their, that is, the martyrs' commitments and experiences as far as the evidence permits, how exactly do we go about that task in the case of these people? How does one know what one knows about martyrs and martyrdom? The impression given deliberately, I think, by Challoner's magnum opus is that everything one would need to know about the subject is both knowable and known. But of course, in so many cases, the exact circumstances of what happened are simply not possible to recover. About the arrests and prosecutions and indeed deaths of many of the people in Challoner's book, we really know virtually nothing. We also need to think about how we know the things that we do know, as well as what I believe are called known unknowns, if that's right, a phrase which is nothing like as stupid as it's often taken to be. In other words, we should know what was recorded by whom and what wasn't about these people and what that might mean historically. While only a tiny fraction of what happened in many martyrs' cases was actually written down, almost everything that we do have on the martyrs of the post-Reformation period was assembled for a specific purpose by someone or other. Nothing like as systematically as, say, John Fox did for the Marian martyrs, but nevertheless with a very clear set of priorities. Those priorities were inevitably controversial. The formulation of a martyrological record usually meant including some people and excluding others. So, for example, there are a number of Catholics who have no particular love or affection for the Jesuit order, and you find that some Catholic martyrologies exclude some Jesuits and vice versa. Even those texts, such as Challoner's, which artfully conceal as much as they reveal, leave a trail of clues scattered here and there as to the context and circumstances of the events which they record, clues which moreover tell us about the political conflicts of the period, both between, I suppose, Catholics and the state on the one hand, but also among Catholics themselves, in a way that virtually no other source can. What, if anything, might one conclude that all this means historically, for the purpose of telling, for constructing narratives of the period? Well, most historians have accepted that for a number of years after 1558, the relatively modest legal structures of conformity and compliance in the English Church left the majority of the conservative and Catholic-minded in relative peace, certainly for the first 20 years or so of Elizabeth's reign. One can argue that it's the breaking of that uneasy consensus and status quo out of which the Catholic martyrological tradition comes. It's something that can be pegged to, for example, the spread of civil strife in Valois, France, in particular the later stages of the wars of religion. In fact, you get succession crises in both kingdoms at more or less at the same time, and they start to shadow each other. So, I mean, it's the relationship between Henry III and then Henry of Navarre, who becomes Henry IV on the one hand, and then in England, Elizabeth and Mary Stuart. And those run more or less side by side. And the claims of each side in those succession crises were made partly by reference to religion. And as a result, the sufferings of English Catholics seemed intensely relevant certainly to French Catholic pamphleteers, as a demonstration of the consequences of living under the rule of a heretical tyrant. In turn, this means that we have to take seriously the claims made by the regime's pamphleteers, especially during the 1580s and 1590s, that those Catholics who were indicted under the treason statutes were indeed being dealt with for sedition and not for their religion. Although, of course, regime spokesmen always made the connection between treason and popery. Now, that wasn't something that all contemporary Catholics were necessarily going to believe, but the point is that for the spokesmen, the representatives of the regime, such as Lord Burleigh, who made that case, particularly you may not have run across it, but in 1583 he releases a pamphlet called The Execution of Justice in England, which is both for an English and a foreign audience, in which he says, yes, some of these people have been dealt with perhaps harshly, but it's only for political reasons. Their religious views are a matter for themselves alone. That line was directed in part to a conformist and conditionally loyalist Catholic constituency. We don't know exactly who all those conformist and loyalist Catholics were, but all through the period there were Catholic voices which said that an all-out war with the state was not going to do anybody any good. Some of those killed by the state for their priesthood might well have been martyrs, but some Catholics said, after the plots and conspiracies which Jesuit clergy particularly had, it was said, fomented, these martyrs had come close to dying in a bad cause. That was not what Catholic religion in England, at any rate, should be about. And you find in the later 1590s there's a visible moving closer together of, on the one hand, Catholics who are starting to reject the political radicalism of, for example, the French Catholic Holy League in France, which itself stood as a sponsor to some of the more committed and radical Catholic interventions in Elizabethan England. And on the other hand, regime members who were prepared to exploit what appeared to be the new green shoots of Catholic loyalism as a weapon against what they took to be Puritan radicalism. Now, for various reasons, one might not want to take the sanitization of the judicial proceedings of the Elizabethan state too far, certainly not to the extent of simply endorsing the ubiquitous textbook-style identification of the Elizabethan government of the Church and State as a mere and uncomplicated middle way, or of Lord Burleigh as the kind of moderate and godly Christian that he probably thought he was, or actually for someone like Thomas Norton, who's one of Burleigh's men of business in Parliament, as a kind of godly Christian, which he probably thought he was too. According to his biographer, Michael Graves, Norton was, quotes, deeply wounded in international Catholic circles by the odious reputation that he acquired there as an interrogator of seminary priests and Jesuits, such as Alexander Bryant, who was executed in December 1581. Well, one imagines that people such as Bryant would have claimed that they were deeply wounded in international Protestant circles, not least by being racked and having needles inserted under their fingernails by people such as Norton. Now, faced with that sort of quasi-confessional impasse, which still skews the historiography of the period, some scholars, notably John Bossy, tried to escape what they regarded as the asphyxiating effects of martyr obsession altogether. Bossy was probably what you might call on the liberal wing of the church in England. I have a feeling that his brother was a Jesuit. In fact, he was a Jesuit. I think he was the headmaster of Stonyhurst, and I've got a feeling that Bossy and his brother probably didn't get on very well. And you can see that there are elements of this stuff all through his scholarly publication. He says at the start of his groundbreaking book entitled The English Catholic Community, 1570 to 1850, that his aim is to escape from the account of post-Reformation Catholicism based on what he calls martyrdom and victimhood. He suggests that a hasty reader of Challoner would hardly suppose that the priests of whom he wrote did much of note between the day they arrived in England and the day they were arrested. So, said Bossy, one should try to get away from all that, not concern oneself with what he called the martyrological perspective. Rather, one should deal with the priest insofar as he survived to get on with his ministry. And that probably was the right approach for the time that Bossy wrote in the 1970s. In fashion, methodologies were also sociological ones, and that's what Bossy was, a sociologist. It was also compatible with revisionist readings of the English Reformation as a failed central government initiative, or much of which failed as an initiative of central government, and something which had much less impact on the provinces than some scholars had previously assumed. Bossy's perspective on post-Reformation Catholicism was a masterpiece, but it was produced in part by deliberately, as he himself stressed, excluding the question of the relationship between, on the one hand, the Catholic fraction of the national church, and on the other hand, the state. The discussions of martyrdom are about precisely that relationship. In fact, martyrdom tells us more about that relationship than almost any other topic, despite or perhaps because of its atypicality. Those instances, the ones recorded by Challoner and actually I dare say by Fox, those are the occasions on which the things that you didn't usually say got said, and the things that you really don't want to do to people, and people certainly don't want done to them, get done. In spite of Bossy's protestations that he wasn't interested in or concerned with that topic, his doctoral thesis, which predated by over 10 years this big book, the published book on the English Catholic community, took an entirely different tack, ironically. It focused on the English Catholic diaspora and on the presence of English Catholics in the religiously and politically chaotic and succession crisis-ridden Kingdom of France, where many of them went when they went into exile. Bossy's thesis, the dissertation, was really about the rise and subsequent fall of a revolutionary impulse among English Catholics. One driver or instigator of that impulse was a sense of fury and outrage at what Bossy, among other historians, chose to call the triumph of the laity. That's a phrase you see bandied around quite a lot in the publications of the 1970s about the Reformation, and about the state-led asset stripping of the material wealth of the church and the destruction of the religious orders. And that provided, said Bossy, the frame of a radical criticism of Elizabethan society, nothing less than, as he called it, a revolt of the clerks. That's the famous phrase forever associated with Bossy's doctoral dissertation. Bossy's account of the clerical enterprise, and of course he used that phrase because it has these political overtones to do with revolutionary and radical action, Boss's account of the clerical enterprise remains the starting place for any sort of understanding of the construction of the post-Reformation Catholic concept of martyrdom. Just to wrap up, there was always a risk, as Peter Lake, to whom I showed a longer version of this piece, commented, there was always a risk that the whole project would turn out to be just, as he called it, one bloody martyr after another. But I want to argue that at the absolute minimum, a whistle-stop tour of the contemporary sites of execution, which after all is what Challoner did, is at least one way of getting into the question of why Catholicism and moreover actual Catholics was such a crucial component of post-Reformation, Reformation and post-Reformation politics. The claim is that these state-led displays of violence are a means of opening up the otherwise opaque structures of a settlement of religion which was based on conformity, that is, people doing what they were told, and if they were not fully in sympathy with whatever the status quo was, not actually saying what they thought. If you line up all these martyr cases end to end, as it were, exactly as Bishop Challoner himself did, they tell you something about the eruption of the Counter-Reformation into English and British politics that you can't easily get from any other source. Traditional Catholic accounts of the English martyrs of successive Reformation and post-Reformation regimes insist that those martyrs are the outstanding representatives of the post-Reformation Catholic community. As is clear, even from those traditional accounts, most Catholics were never close to becoming martyrs themselves. But the issues which informed the prosecutions of those who did end up dying as they saw it for their religion were of concern to many more people than those whom the mainstream historiography of the period has tended to regard simply as zealots. And arguably we should read those martyr narratives in order to work out what the violent confrontations between a minority of undoubtedly zealous Catholics and the regime of the day tell us about the wider Catholic community and the political processes of the reform of religion in 16th and 17th century England. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Questions for Michael? Ariel?
Don't think anybody else wants to.
Thank you, Michael. Fascinating. I've got loads of questions, but I know other people might want to come in. So a couple of little ones and then the actual sort of one I wanted to ask. Is Green of Dorchester the man they played football with his head? Is that the one?
They did do that at one point, after they stuck little twigs in it, yes.
That's the one, yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. Of the... you mentioned a number of martyrs, and yet you haven't mentioned the one that will probably be most familiar to everybody in this audience, namely Thomas More from this period. So could perhaps you say a little bit about the process, about because More was beatified in the late 19th century and canonised 1940s, is that right?
Beatified in the late 19th century, that's right, and then the canonisation came in 1935.
35 then, so,
yes.
So that fits in perfectly with your framework. But my big question is sort of relates to sort of some of the things John was saying. You're saying in relation to Fox, that Fox's martyr project is more about sort of English exceptionalism, sort of proto-nationalism, providentialism, whereas the martyrology that you're talking about seems to be more a rewriting of history rather than a forward-looking. This is a backward-looking version of history, whereas Fox is forward-looking. Would that be fair?
In a way, yes. Challoner's this book entitled The Memoirs of Missionary Priests is highly unusual in the context of his overall published oeuvre, in the sense that most of what he wrote was devotional and spiritual. And it's far from clear really why he did this at the time that he did. There's very little surviving archival material about the purposes of putting this into print at the time in the 1740s. On the other hand, it is actually about, I mean, I'm not a literature scholar, but literature scholars have pointed out to me that it's as well as recording, as you say, the horrific instances of cruelty exercised on the bodies of people like this, as you say, this priest called Hugh Green down in Dorchester in 1642, which is, I mean, what he does essentially is he reprints a contemporary manuscript which describes the, I mean, probably even by contemporary standards, fairly appalling use of mob violence on this particular individual, just as the Civil War is starting, and so one can understand why in Puritan Dorchester that might have been the case. it's almost a sanitization of it. It's written in this kind of 18th century language of civility and calmness, and there's this sort of rhetoric of moderation. And it's the implication, I think the implication of something else, that's what happened in the past, and we don't do that anymore, which is why the relationship between Catholics and the state in the future should be different. It's something like that. But Challoner gives virtually there's no evidence of his working. It is an extraordinary book. It starts, as I won't go on, but right in the middle of the mid-Elizabethan period in the 1570s. And you think, did he know about the Henrician Reformation? I'm sure this happened before 1577, wouldn't he have mentioned that? And it's all this, it's incredibly arch and naive. And you sort of think, think the man a simpleton? Because he's not actually a simpleton. He's using historical documents in a way which is actually very, very clever. Because the way it reads, it all looks finished, cut and dried, which I think with Fox is not the case. Fox, doesn't he keep going back to his sources and saying, oh yes, I may have made a mistake. I was right all along, but perhaps that manuscript wasn't the right one. I've got 4 others, and so I'll just republish my book. And yes, Challoner doesn't do that. It's all set in stone. And it's highly, well, in that sense, highly convincing. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Just before we pass on, a few words about Thomas More, please.
Yes, I mean, I think there is somebody else, Bill Shields, who is supposed to be publishing a book on that topic. So I deliberately kept away from it because I suspect he's done it all. But I mean, I think this comes in the mid-1930s. It's the 400th anniversary of the execution. It's More and Fisher together. And this, the implication is that it's less controversial than it would be, or than the recognition of the Elizabethan clergy would subsequently be, because More as a layman, he's standing up against the tyranny of the state rather than for any kind of opposition to Protestantism. The trial is actually about his refusal to comply with state procedure. And I think that makes it more acceptable to the English establishment. And that's why it goes through at Rome so quickly, actually, without even the necessary, they don't go through all the necessary, normally Rome demands 2 miracles. I think there may have been 1, and Rome waives the procedure in that case. It causes a certain amount of controversy in some circles, but it's regarded as more acceptable to do that in his and Fisher's case than it would have been, or it was less controversial than with some of the Elizabethan clergy.
Yes, I'm not an expert using the microphone, but I hope this is working.
It's fine.
I'm certainly not a historian. I'm intrigued, though, by the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850, and whether that was an explicable door opener politically, and whether the members of Parliament who passed that act were conscious of the lighting a fuse about the relationship between the Church and the Catholic Church and the English state.
One imagines it was very controversial with some people. In some ways, it's only a logical development of the structure of episcopal regulation, which is already in place. This institution of individuals known as vicars apostolic, who have they have episcopal authority, but it's kind of it's delegated, so it's not full ordinary status, as I understand it. But it's a development upon what's already there. Now I mean, I'm not a 19th century historian really. I imagine there were a number of protests, probably in Parliament and elsewhere, at the at this step. I believe that Manning makes a fairly inflammatory, releases a fairly inflammatory statement about what Rome has done, and this certainly causes protests in some quarters. And in fact, I mean, very shortly they start doing all the things that probably some Protestants would be worried about, which is embedding a Catholic tradition in public and popular consciousness in a way that they hadn't previously been able to do. And this is one of those projects to start constructing a historical tradition and giving it popular effect in a way that it hadn't been there before. So probably that's right.
Chris?
Thank you very much. I couldn't help thinking as you were talking about on the theoretical section that I'd heard all this before in terms of the early church. And I just wondered whether you got any reflections on comparative martyrology, because I think that the way in which the boss's sort of line and the kind of critique of the functions of martyrology which he looks at, I think one could say about how it is that it grew up and what its function was within early Christianity. And I think quite rightly it is now being kind of looked into and said, look, there wasn't this massive persecution, and these collection of martyrology, what on earth were they doing, putting this sort of stuff together? Because this wasn't actually helping ordinary people to be the disciples of Jesus Christ.
They've always, yes. Well, I think there are two issues there. The first one is that last point that you made, and I noticed with the quote that Martyr put up on the screen, that thing about, we will not tolerate those who compromise with the enemy. A large number of people saying, well, you try leading anything like a normal life if you don't compromise with the enemy from time to time, and perhaps they're not all that bad, and in any case there's just as good evidence for or direction for live and let live as for continual confrontation and suffering and all the bad things that persecution brings, including the faithful falling away from the faith and so on. And that's the first point. There's always been that we might call counter-martyrological discourse in most ages of the church where there's conflict over the Christian tradition. I think the other thing is, which you're gesturing at, is the construction of martyrologies, the rules that all martyrologists tend to follow. And this is something that Thomas Freeman has talked about quite a lot, which is, in order to make each martyr sort of as like as possible, that archetype of martyrdom, calm, serene individual, unafraid in the face of death, willing to suffer for the truth, no hatred for his enemies, love for all the world, all that, yes, which may actually describe many of them. You tend to cross out, delete, or gloss over all the little, you might say, interesting details, which would the ones that would tell you exactly why they're being done in. And in fact, occasionally you get there's a Jesuit in Rome who works as a research assistant for another member of the society who's a historian called Bartley. He's an Englishman called Christopher Green, and it's through his collections of research notes that we actually have many of the documents, contemporary documents, which were subsequently, the originals were subsequently destroyed. And as Green's copying away, he says, in the course of the trial of so-and-so, the Lord Chief Justice Sir Edward Coke said many harsh and cruel things about the martyr. In fact, spoke for 2.5 hours. But I shall not. I shall pass over them. And you say, no, don't pass over them. Tell me what they were. I'd really like to know. Because Green says it's not important, because all you need to do is understand that he was truly a martyr for Christ. You think, no, I would like to have known what Cook said, because now the original document's gone. So I think that may be what you're gesturing at, and I think that is, that probably is the case in every age where people have collected material of this kind.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I mean, I knew about Challoner, but that whole process of beatifications and canonizations, that was all new to me. And I guess I wondered how much this was simply a kind of internally focused campaign, whether it's simply about consolidating, reshaping Catholic identity, or how much effort is made to publicise it, to get it out. So the Pathé News clip of John Southwest's remains been taken into Westminster Cathedral. It was very striking. So do we have much more evidence of a concerted attempt to get this story, if you like, out into the mainstream, into the media, rather than it just being a purely internal Catholic martyr?
Yes, I mean, yes, you put your finger on, the crucial point is that one of the, there are a number of legal and canonical categories that you have to satisfy in order to persuade Rome to go through all the steps of this fairly pernickety legal procedure. And one of them is that the memory of the martyrs arises through public acclaim in their own time and is continued without interruption until the time at which Rome makes its decision. So you need to produce proof that that's the case, and that you can only do by very organised campaigns of publicity, which of course in some ways looks highly artificial, because you're actually stimulating something that may not originally have been there. And in fact, certainly through the 1950s and 60s, the people who worked in this office in the basement in this Farm Street just off Berkeley Square, they worked like crazy to produce the evidence, or that such memory had been fostered within the Catholic community for 400 years, down to the time at which they start to compile these documents. Oh, it's quite extraordinary. They preach sermons, martyr sermons. There's Martyrs Sundays, usually it's in July. They preach sermons all over the country. There are little medals, pamphlets, children's books, pop-up cardboard models of the execution of John Bost. You name it, they do it. Little films, TV documentaries about priests hiding holes. They go and see the filmmaker Zinnemann, the one who made Man for All Seasons, to try and persuade him to do John Gerard instead. It's the that's one of the interesting things about. So I mustn't go on, but one of the interesting things about it is the people who do that after the war and up till probably the end of the 50s are what you might call hardliners. They're people who've got a Challinarian view of the Reformation, and they're not sympathetic, shall we say, to other Christian denominations, particularly. And then, just at the point where most of the documentary material is being compiled and typed out, I think there are 8 secretaries working there at one time. One of whom is the daughter of Evelyn Waugh. They're very, very connected, these people. Graham Greene was another person associated with this, sort of the literary effort to get the cause recognised. As you get into the 60s, the rise of ecumenism makes the project extremely difficult. And in the mid-60s, you get some of the vice postulators saying, it's not going to work. It's probably over. Public enthusiasm is actually waning, and it appears to be out of step with modern attitudes towards ecumenical reunion. And actually, as you get up to the canonization in 1970, you get this in the newspapers and sort of the Times and so on an almost daily basis, people saying this is no longer the right way to approach interfaith relations. And at the time of the canonization, when Paul VI makes the announcement in St. Peter's, it is actually phrased in ecumenical terms. He says this is not about division among Christians, this is about recognizing the sacrifice of those who in our day would oppose the materialism of the world. And it's a sort of ecumenical cri de coeur, actually. And yes, so as they had to adapt to a changing culture. Yes, a changing culture.
Okay, out of time now. Thank you very much, Michael. Michael Questier.